I'm always curious to know, how did you feel about how the industry was last year, aligned with what we were thinking would happen this last year. So how would you describe the landscape? I saw that you were quite almost spot on, almost totally spot on artificial intelligence.
Mm,
So which aspect of the trend last year did anything caught you by surprise?
sure. Yeah, I think it's hard doing predictions, isn't it? Because, if you're too specific, you're definitely not going to be right. But I think the underlying trends are relatively easy to predict and talk about. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, it's reading them back, it's yeah, they seem reasonably good, but there's always a few surprises as well.
So how has the promotion of this year's report, how has it been? Um, Hope
Yeah,
you're
I
not
think
stressed. Has it been good?
yeah, I think we've had a lot of interest. It's yeah, from different countries as well, so a lot from countries outside Europe, in Asia, Africa. Germany has been very strong this year, yeah, for the trends.
Then how long did this report take to put together finally?
It's about 6 weeks, so from start to finish in terms of putting together all the survey and talking to the publishers and then writing it, publishing it, about 6 weeks, yeah. So quite quick.
Yeah, okay. I think we're all set. Everything, all the live stream is happening. People are already joining. So let me work and get the show rolling. Hi everyone. My name is Paul Adepoju, and I'm the community manager for the International Center for Journalists, Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. And I will start by saying this is our first webinar for the year. So I would like to wish I would like to wish oh, what am I touching? I'd like to wish everybody happy new year, and I hope the new year has been to a great start for you. And around late last year, I asked some of our forum members whether they are working over the holiday, and nearly 80% said they'll be working over the holiday, which shows the fact that there is virtually no rest or no holiday for the media industry. And I hope you continue to stay safe. And even those that are at the front line, we know what is happening to journalists that are covering crises and some of the most important crises of their lifetime in different parts of the world. I want to say hi to you and hope you are keeping safe. Every year, we usually start our year by talking about what is expected to happen in the media landscape for the year. And this year is happily, and we're excited that it's not different because we will be having this discussion today on trends and predictions for 2024. And if you've been with us for more than a year now, you will be familiar with the guest that we are having today, because we've always been opportune to work together to discuss this trend. And I'm talking about Nic Newman. And Nic Newman is joining us today from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. How are you doing today, Nick? And thanks
Hi,
for joining
Paul.
us.
Great to be here again. Yeah, good to see you.
Yes, absolutely. I know we have a lot to go through today. And I just want to say thank you very much for everyone that is joining us today. And if you would like to engage with us, our chat box is always open. I want to also say hi to everybody that is joining us on our two Facebook live streams, the official page of the International Journalist Network, IJNet, and the group page for ICFJ's Family Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting. The comment box below the video that you're watching right now is where you can actually actively engage us. There is a lot to unpack in this report, and I wouldn't want to preempt Nick, so I will allow Nick to take it from here, and I'll bring it all back home during the interactive session. Nick, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. And yeah, it's really good to be back again. Just a little bit of context, first of all. So for people who know the Reuters Institute, we run a fellowship program, and we also do research into, journalism in a range of countries around the world. What I mainly do in this report is look at sort of some of the trends, how technology might affect the journalism industry, and a little bit about the business trends as well. And we do another report which is based on audience trends, which we do later in the year. But this one's mainly focused on what the industry thinks is going to happen. And it's based on some interviews, but also a survey that we do with hundreds of senior industry leaders, editors, CEOs, digital directors from, as you can see here, more than 50 countries. So very wide range of countries. I mean, mainly focused on Europe, but we have countries from representation from all over the world, Latin America, Asia, Africa, taken part this year. And I guess, just starting with the big picture, confidence, less than half are confident about the prospects for journalism in the year ahead. And a significant proportion are distinctly unconfident about the year ahead. And this is similar to last year, actually. There's a lot of uncertainty around, but much lower than it was a few years ago. So we're living through these times of uncertainty, political uncertainty, uncertainty in business revenues, as you can see here from this quote, and concerns about what might happen on the advertising revenue side, really affecting employment prospects, and also what's happening in terms of traffic, because we've seen these very significant falls in referral traffic, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. And then around the world, you have so many challenges around independent journalism, particularly in countries outside Europe, where many journalist organizations are struggling to maintain their independence. Partly because of the economic situation as well. Taking a market like South Africa here, here's the CEO of the Daily Maverick talking about how just in the market generally, the market and the advertising market, shrunk by 2/3 in the last decade, or number of journalists. So it's a difficult picture in many countries, not in every country, but in many countries. So that's kind of, if you like, the framing of it. And then obviously on top of that, you've got artificial intelligence and the next round of disruption, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So one of the things that's really on people's minds right now is this issue of social media referrals and the decline that we've seen in social media referrals. So this is some data that we sourced from an analytics company called Chartbeat. So they work with over 2,000 publishers, or around 2,000 news publishers. And this is an aggregate view of what's happened to Facebook referrals in the last year. So basically, they've halved. This is a huge change. And it's not just Facebook, it's also Twitter. You can't really see Twitter X decline because the scale is so much smaller. Facebook remains really very important. But still, if you look at the actual numbers, 27% year-on-year decline in Twitter as well. So what we're seeing is this shift from where you make a post in Facebook or Twitter and you get referrals back to your website that you can then monetize. That model is really sort of starting to break down. So people are talking about the end of mass referral and what that might mean for publishers. And publishers are really worried about it. In our survey, 63% said they were very worried about these declines. So what can you do about it? What are publishers thinking about doing? So this is the trend we've seen over the last few years, to invest much more in direct relationships. So less about reaching lots and lots of people. You don't know who they are. How can you build closer, more valuable relationships with individuals? Maybe get them to pay at the end of the day as well. Some people are considering cutting costs. Some of the respondents to the survey are looking at trying to swap out Facebook for other platforms. And here many people are trying to do both, of course. So this is an editor of a tabloid in Norway. Prioritizing the own channels is really the primary strategy, and then recognizing that young people aren't necessarily going to come to platforms. So we're going to need to invest more in some different platforms, maybe Snapchat or TikTok, for those younger users. So it's much more intentional, I think, in terms of how people might be using some of these alternative platforms. So we asked our publishers this year, where are you going to put more effort? Are you going to put more effort in terms of platforms? Are you going to put more effort into Facebook, more effort into YouTube, or? And this is one of my favorite charts. So essentially, what we've done here is ask people whether they're going to put more effort or whether they're going to put less effort, and we've taken away the less effort from the more effort. And what you see is WhatsApp at the top, maybe a bit of a surprise to some people. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. And then the rise of sort of video platforms like TikTok and also YouTube Shorts, people putting more effort into that. LinkedIn for some publishers that have more of a sort of upmarket business profile. And then you can see that Facebook and X, much less effort, or in fact, negative effort. People say they're going to put less effort into it on balance. And many publishers, of course, have given up on those platforms. Here's a senior editor in India, for example, talking about these as a place for consumption or for traffic are pretty much dead for us. So again, this chart I think really shows this switch into a more complex information distributed ecosystem, but also one that doesn't involve so much Facebook. Critically, Facebook, of course, have made their own decisions about pulling back from news. That's one of the reasons why we've seen such big falls. Facebook as a company, or Meta as a company, of course, owns WhatsApp, and they have leaned into news a little bit in the last year. And so there's a bit of excitement around how people can turn the heavy usage of WhatsApp for any purpose into opportunities for journalism. That's always been a struggle, but in the last year, WhatsApp have been opening up these so-called broadcast channels. And that allows any publisher to push content, broadcast content, if you like, to people through WhatsApp. People can't comment openly, but they can take those WhatsApp posts into their own discussions, and they can have discussions around them there. So this is really interesting, and we're starting to see publishers really embrace this as an option to at least partly replace what's happening with Facebook. And what you see is organizations like the New York Times, for example, which started very early, already having, say, 6 million followers in WhatsApp. You see other publishers kind of focusing on niches and passions, because that's how WhatsApp is organized quite often. So here's the Daily Mail focusing on a channel for the Kardashians, for example. People can subscribe to that and talk about it within their environments, and others like the Financial Times focusing on serious stories like Israel Gaza. So lots of different options for publishers, I think, there, and for journalists. I think the second thing is obviously short form video, which we've seen really grow very fast in the last few years. And so we talk a lot about TikTok and Reels, and I think the problem here is that quite often in these environments, it has been, say, social media influencers rather than traditional media brands that have necessarily got the traction. So in this example, which are all examples of short form video on Gaza, you've got an influencer called Dylan Page who has some of the biggest following on TikTok of news. He's producing news pretty much every day, getting for this Gaza video 5 million views, and much lower for the New York Times, much lower for the BBC. So it's this challenge of can you really talk to young people in a language that also is right for your brand? Do you really understand the context in which people are accessing some of the short form video, and can you tell stories impartially and effectively in this kind of format in the first place? So I think this will be the year when publishers really put more effort into this and try and see whether they can make these short form platforms work better. So I've talked a bit about social media. I think the real fear for this year is that the traffic that publishers get directly from search engines is going to fall in the same way as we saw traffic from social media fall. And the reason for that is the disruption of artificial intelligence and generative AI and chatbots, and this sort of fear that as Google and others roll out Bing, roll out examples of you can, instead of having you put a query in and you get 8 blue links, one of which, most of which are news sites on news queries. Instead, you will get an answer directly. So the search interface will generate an answer to your question. And the links, although they're still here in this experimental interface from Google, are much lower down. There's fewer of them. And if you provided the answer, why would people click in the first place? So some publishers, some journalists like Johnny here in Argentina, really sees this as an existential threat, that this search generated experiences will replace some of the things that media companies do. And we don't know how fast this is going to go or how extensive it's going to be, and the extent to which this is going to be rolled out. But we know that these experiences are already existing. And it's not just search. We also have experiences where you can, these chatbots that you can go to, or you can put a browser extension on. So this is one that I use regularly called Perplexity, and you can just ask a question about why Pakistan launched the missile attacks, and you get an answer back. Now there are links. You can see links to Al Jazeera, BBC, Reuters, etc. But if you basically got the information you need, why would you click on those links? So that's the challenge. And in some of the interfaces, this is one called Pi. You can ask what's been happening in Gaza today. It will come back with a summary, essentially. Do you need more? There are no links at all within this. So the fear is that journalists are going to be disrupted by these new sort of conversational interfaces. It may or may not happen to any large degree, but not surprising then that we've seen so much sort of legal action this year where the publishers are really trying to protect their intellectual copyright. So the New York Times is suing OpenAI and Microsoft, arguing essentially that they have trained their platform on New York Times content without, and in many cases, returning exact matched articles or parts of articles, and that they are effectively competing as a trusted news source. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that pans out. We've also seen publishers stopping the AI platforms accessing their content through their crawlers. And in research that we're going to publish in a few weeks' time, that ranges from 80% of the top US publishers have now done that, and much less in some other countries, such as Mexico. However, when we talk to publishers about this, they're very, very concerned that they get money back from these AI companies to compensate for any loss of traffic, but there's not a lot of confidence that that's going to happen. So half of the people who responded to our survey said at the end of the day, we're not going to get much money out of this. That's been the experience, obviously, with some of the social platforms, and this is really the next chapter of that story. Or that if there is money, it'll mainly go to those big media companies like the New York Times, like Axel Springer, and small companies will be left out into the cold. So obviously all this kind of leads on to the business models of news and how they are changing. And obviously we've seen a lot of big shifts away from purely supported by advertising, because much of the advertising has gone to these big companies, and towards more paid content. But we've also seen, because of the economic difficulty, the growth that we've seen in subscriptions and memberships, that's slowed down. And of course, in many parts of the world, people just can't afford to pay for news and are much less likely to pay for news. However, just a few trends to mention. So I think one of them is about for those publishers that are already down, trying to get people to pay for news, trying to bundle in other things is going to be a big trend. So we started to see this last year with the New York Times, amongst others, sort of bundling in news, games, cooking, sport, product reviews into a single package. Because if you do that, then you're much less likely to churn, to unsubscribe from that news organization. We see a lot of Nordic publishers doing the same, where you have a combination of local, national, or podcasts that have value. People are bundling those together and giving one single price, sort of simplicity. So I think that's one trend. Another trend is to say, well, can we offer subscription products, but just at a lower price, not necessarily the whole package, but parts of the package. So maybe more newsletters that people charge for, but at a lower price point, or podcasts. So again, this is a trend we've seen last year, and I think that's going to accelerate. And I think we're also going to see more publishers just trying this sort of mixed model. So even though advertising remains the primary thing, let's at least start to get loyal users paying for some kind of premium content. So I think many more publishers will try to do that in many parts of the world that traditionally have not done subscription as well. So I think you saw CNN talking about subscription yesterday with their new CEO, for example. That's a new trend for many sort of what you might think of TV companies starting to deploy these digital mechanisms. Big publishers like the Mail Online that have traditionally only done advertising also starting to charge for some news as well. So I think this is going to be a really interesting thing to watch. And then related to the business problems, I think it's also affecting, the formats that people use. So instead of producing lots of text and websites, maybe there are other ways, cheaper ways to create businesses around news, maybe around video, maybe around newsletters, maybe around podcasts. So this has been a trend again for some time, but you can see here when we ask people, publishers, are you going to put more effort or less effort into text, video, newsletters, podcasts? Overwhelmingly, they're going to put more effort this year into video and newsletters and podcasts, and they're not going to put much more effort into, or any effort into, producing more articles. And a lot of that is to do with the business models. So, potentially there is more upside financially to running a newsletter that doesn't require as much effort, for example, as a website, or creating audio or video, because potentially the advertising premiums are higher on some of those things than they are on text. So some of this is related to the business side as well. Podcasts is very, very interesting, and they're popular, of course, in many parts of the world. They've been one of the few areas of growth that we've seen. So audio of all kinds. But I think one of the really interesting trends we're going to see this year is that much of that audio becoming more visual. So this is particularly the case around political podcasts. So political podcasts, you used to listen in your ears. Increasingly, you're going to be watching them this year on YouTube or other video platforms. So Top Left, The Rest is Politics, a very successful podcast here in the UK. So they're now in a studio. It looks like television, really. On the top right, you have Tucker Carlson from the US, and he has been, since he left Fox, he's been basically trying to build a direct brand using podcasts, which he films. And this year with the elections, he's looking for subscription publishers as well. So essentially starting to charge for news. And across the world, with all the elections we're having this year, I think political podcasts is going to be a real trend. More political podcasts, more visual political podcasts is something to watch out for. We've talked for a bit about one of the most worrying trends that we see in our audience research data is the percentage of people who say that they haven't seen any news in the last week. This is particularly in the developed world, so much less in Africa or Latin America, where people still, news remains really, really important, and most people are still accessing regularly. But in countries like the UK, US, we see maybe 10% who say they don't really consume any news in an average week, and that's been growing. And then you have another group of people who are increasingly say they avoid certain stories, like the war in Israel, Gaza, or what's going on in Ukraine. So there's a sense of news fatigue eating away at willingness to read or pay, as this comment says. So we asked people in the survey, what can you do to counter this sort of indifference, if you like, to news, whether it's wars or climate change, people turning away from it. And here are some of the things we put to our respondents. So some of the initiatives that they are taking this year include explaining the news better. So this sort of idea of simple explanatory videos or Q&As. So doing more of that. Doing more journalism that doesn't just point out problems, but also offers solutions or gives people a sense of hope or agency, inspiring stories, greater diversity in the newsroom. So you have more diverse perspectives. So it's not just, the same old stories. And making the language easier to access, or the formats easier to access, I think is also important. When it comes to, just give us the positive news, journalists are always very, very dubious about that. And they don't want any kind of dumbing down in terms of entertainment either. So just moving lastly on to the question of the next disruption, the next big disruption. So if we think of the last 10 years, it's really been defined by social media and mobile, and this disruption, this twin disruption that we've seen, disrupting business models, formats, the speed with which people expect to access the news. The next 10 years is really going to be about how this next wave of technology is going to affect journalism, and it does so in many different ways. So these are just some of the ways in which artificial intelligence is being used in newsrooms today. And we've ranked this by importance of our sample of industry leaders. So the first one is using artificial intelligence to automate various tasks in the newsroom. And in many cases, this does mean cutting out certain types of jobs that we've been doing for ages. So copy editing, some of that can be assisted by artificial intelligence, for example, transcription, tagging, translation of content. So there's lots of ways in which you can make content processes quicker and more efficient. And so publishers are really focusing on that. And then secondly, distribution and using it to show more relevant content. Now, when we did this a couple of years ago, it was the other way around. So it was the distribution side that people were focusing on, not the back-end automation. And I think what's changed is these generative AI technologies, and the speed of the advance of those means that there really are now at a point where newsrooms can see the financial benefits of putting those in. And then you have content creation, commercial uses, coding, news gathering. There's lots of other ways in which publishers are using it. What we haven't seen yet so much is this emerging in the product. So actually seeing customers seeing stuff that's created by AI in different ways. But I think this year we're going to see a lot more of that. And just 4 examples. So the first one is we're starting to see now at the top of news stories, little summaries. As you can see in this example, there's a little label which says this summary has been made with the support of AI tools from OpenAI, quality ensured. So there's a reader, there's a human reader that's checked them. But that quick version that is produced by Aftonbladet in Sweden, and there are many other examples, we're going to see a lot of this. And what they found was that by putting a little summary at the top, you actually increase the engagement and the likelihood of reading through, because people are sort of getting into the story in really accessible ways. So that's really interesting. Then we're seeing a lot of AI generated images. So again, the story may be written by a human, but you're looking for an illustration. Previously, you might have had to employ a graphic artist to do this. Now you can just get an AI to create a style for, in this case, a recipe. The third example is actually writing stories themselves. So this is essentially, instead of a journalist writing the story, you have artificial intelligence looking at various source material and turning that into an article. And then, of course, that is then checked by a human. So it makes it much cheaper and more efficient. This is much more controversial, but there is a news organization in Germany that now has 5% of its stories written by this artificial journalist called Clara Internack, so not a real person. And then going even further, we're starting to see 24-hour television news channels. So these are not humans, these are avatars, and they read the news 24 hours a day. It's News GPT is not something you would want to watch particularly. It's using AI-driven images and text that it's scraping from different organizations. But there are other organizations starting this year which are doing this much better. So the idea that they have is personalizing the news. If you do it through avatars, you can create more relevant news. You can create news in any language at a much cheaper cost base. So this is a nightmare scenario for many of us journalists, and we can discuss that in the chat. But some of this is happening. Some of this we're going to see this year for real. Publishers, when you talk to them, what are they worried about? They are worried about reputational risk of use of AI, particularly around content creation. So the potential risk, the biggest one is content creation and news gathering to some extent, because that involves the integrity of the content. They're not worried about back-end in automation or distribution recommendations. So this is a quote from senior digital leader at the Times of London. So the most compelling user case is the automation of routine tasks. And we do not believe that AI is a substitute for reporting. So making that distinction between assisting journalists and actually going out and doing the reporting. And I think that is the consensus right now, but there are obviously a few outliers. And I do think we will see these sort of two different groups. We'll see some people who are using AI responsibly. There are others who are basically just trying to make money off cheap automated content. And we're going to see both. And that, of course, the consumers won't necessarily be able to distinguish between those two. So I think one prediction around AI is that this year we're going to see this explosion of new tools to help journalists in decision making, often integrated into content management systems. So this is one that the Finnish news organization Helsingin Sanomat, which is their sort of major quality newspaper. So it's integrated this little bot. And so you write the story and then it will kind of suggest or prompt you to add an enhancement. So previously you'd have had to go looking for that. It's just making the process quicker. It maybe makes suggestions. So there's another one that Aftonbladet has, which is you're writing your story and it has this youth assistant that pops up and says, it's the language you're using is a bit complicated. Can you make it simpler? So it's kind of helping to make the news more accessible, giving you suggestions, but the human's always in control. And then finally, in thinking about all the elections this year, so 40 countries, I think more than 40 countries have these sort of really major national elections this year. So it's a really important year electorally, and people are really worried about what's going to happen with this sort of flood of synthetic content, because these tools are now in the hands of everybody, not just journalists. How they're going to be used, they're in the hands of people who might want to micro-target and use this technology in ways that we don't understand and we don't have protections for. And so in elections around the world, we've already seen manipulated images or manipulated voice being used using generative AI to intentionally mislead in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases. So the Argentinian elections had a lot of AI used on both sides to make the case for or against a particular candidate. And in the US election, we've already seen, campaign videos that mix real images, in this case of Donald Trump and Anthony Fauci, with ones that are made up to suit the narrative of a particular politician. These things are not labeled, so there's no defense currently from the law or from platforms particularly. So the danger, 70% of respondents to our survey think that generative AI will lower trust levels, and the fear is this explosion of crap content has the potential to shake that trust in the media. Other people are a bit more optimistic. They think that maybe if it's really bad in social media, people will turn back to responsible media. So, we can only hope. Maybe that's wishful thinking. And in terms of the predictions around that, I think the regulators are getting involved in a very significant way. Obviously, there's already some protection in the new Digital Services Act, which provides potential fines of up to 6% of income, or they can ban platforms that do not take down, do not live up to their community guidelines or take down some of this content. And of course, the EU is already investigating X for not sufficiently well moderating and potentially breaking EU laws on hate speech. So there are laws now in place in the EU, and there's an AI Act coming in the EU as well. So, we're starting to see the beginning of regulation, but as we've seen elsewhere, that can also lead to unintentional consequences. The platforms themselves are really stepping up their defenses in terms of before these big elections, more moderators, but also requiring more disclosure when you upload something that has substantially used AI. You have to declare that in political advertising or in general. So a number of platforms implementing that. And then fact checkers, of course, also now integrating AI to identify claims that can be debunked much more quickly. So AI is kind of being used on the positive side and on the negative side, and there's going to be a lot more action on that this year. So just to finish, Paul, and then we'll get into, I guess, some questions. I think some of the questions is, how far and fast will AI disrupt these business models? And we don't really know the answer to that. And much will depend on what happens with negotiations and whether these negotiations will produce money that compensates publishers or not. And also, how can we embrace the risks as journalists? Sorry, embrace the benefits and manage the risks. So that's a sort of key challenge. Secondly, that question I just raised about trust. So what's going to happen? Is this going to be overblown? Is it actually going to have a significant effect in particular elections? And what will that mean for public reactions? So much we don't know about what the public's going to think about AI created content. They may think it's fantastic. It makes it much easier and more convenient, or they may really hate it and sort of really want journalists to emphasize the quality of their reporting, the humanity of what they do. The big problem of falling referral, news avoidance, how do we strengthen direct traffic? How do we rebuild that connection between journalists and audiences? And then I think, some really interesting questions about whether we're too wedded to, doing text and whether we can embrace more non-text formats, whether that is audio, whether it's video, whether it's newsletters, whether it's even bots, just as new ways to interact with people going forward. So lots of stuff to think about in the current year. And if you're interested in, I'm sure, Paul, we can distribute these slides if people want them, but also the full report is available for free from our website, Trends and Predictions on the front page. So just search for the Reuters Institute if you want to know more. But I will stop there and we can get into conversation.
Thank you very much, Nick. And thank you for that. And I think the best place for me to start from is to share the link to the full report. I'll put it in the chat box right now so that everyone that wants to access the report can do it. So the link in the chat box right now takes you to the full report. And I think a place that I would like to start is which is quite obvious. This year is a very important election year. We have the election in the US and several other countries. So what insights regarding the media landscape? How do you think these very important elections are going to determine any aspect of journalism, considering previous ones had impact on this ecosystem even till today? So what insight can you share?
I mean, I think obviously journalists get very excited about elections, and for some media organizations, I mean, this is where you get a lot more traffic, you get a lot more engagement from audiences, and so both from a business point of view and from a journalistic point of view, it's something journalists care about very much. I think the challenge is that what we've seen in our audience data is audiences are becoming less interested in politics in Western countries anyway, not necessarily in other parts of the world. And I think that's because people feel that politicians don't have as much control anymore, or they don't feel as relevant. The things that politicians are talking about don't feel relevant to people's lives, or nothing seems to change. So there's a real disillusion with politics in general, and that has translated into the number of people who regularly say that they're interested in political news, for example, in many countries. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see if that can be reversed. And I think there are clearly going to be some elections that are absolutely critical this year. Not just for that. The US election obviously stands out because what happens there will also affect what happens with their foreign policy, and that's obviously a lot will be written about that, a lot will be read about it, and that's an opportunity for journalists. And journalists, obviously, that's part of what we live for, is to make a difference and to inform people so that they know when they go into the polling booth that they've got the information they need to make an appropriate choice.
Yeah, thank you. And I think another question that I have noted here is you mentioned the fact that in some parts of the world, what we are having, what is happening is quite different. And I think I would like you to take a minute to actually highlight some of the interesting trends in the developing world that are in sharp contrast to what we have in the US, in the UK, and elsewhere.
I think I mean, one of the things is that people are more interested in news still. So we haven't seen the same, rapid declines in interest in news or in politics. And, we've only recently, in the last 5 years or so, started doing work in polling work, audience work in African countries like Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria. And interest in news is and politics is still much higher there. Oddly, the trust in media also hasn't fallen significantly in many of those countries. I don't know if that's just like that trust in general is higher in some of those countries, or criticism of journalists is less. I imagine not, but so some of those trends, and then obviously the use of social media in many of those countries is much higher, so very high across all Latin America, and so people have even weaker direct connections with the media companies. And then the final thing I would call out is that the trend towards paying for news is much slower in those markets as well. So there's much more dependence on the advertising model, and the platforms have taken a lot of that advertising revenue. So those media companies that remain are in a much weaker position and potentially much more dependent on government advertising or government interference. So I would pick out some of those as some of the challenges, not necessarily the trends, but some of the challenges. Some of the other trends are just the same everywhere, right? The move to mobile, the move away from watching television news and radio news, that's happening everywhere, and that's going to impact all parts of the world over a different time period.
Yes, I think something that is also really, really important to really, really talk about has to do with what these media companies see regarding growth growth potentials in terms of you've really highlighted how different mediums, different approaches threaten um, the revenues of media outlets. But are we getting to the point where we can see that the plateauing of revenue generation in the media sector, or what are the feelers you can share regarding this?
Well, I think this is a challenge for all media companies, but not all media companies are the same. And increasingly, there are different business models. There are, now we have the possibility of a journalist on their own building direct relationships, charging for content, and distribution is virtually free. So there are lots more opportunities. But I think the general for upmarket news organizations in, say, the developed world, there is an opportunity for a few of those media companies to charge people directly for something that is truly distinctive and different and high quality. And there's a small proportion of people who are prepared to pay significant amounts of money for that. And probably over time in many other countries, that will also be true. So if you are going up market, there will be room for one or two brands that can build up subscription models. We've seen in countries like Kenya, some publishers trying to build up, and Nigeria, some publishers trying to start that process again, but it's obviously difficult. I think beyond that, obviously the print model is failing. So over time, that is going to be, and that provides most of the income for a lot of the other publications. So that's a really challenging. How's the rest of the ecosystem going to be funded? How's local journalism going to be funded? So I think part of that will be lower cost models, and we're sort of starting to see, 1, 2, 3 people serving local news in more efficient ways. Perhaps, technologies like artificial intelligence will ultimately help with that. And then in the middle, it's going to be a lot of mixed models. We already see that, foundation funding for certain kind of journalism, events, e-commerce, sponsorship, advertising, reader revenue. You kind of put together a patchwork of things. But part of it is sort of resizing your cost base, and part of it's going to be trying to bring in different revenue streams as your print revenue stream goes down. And then I don't know what's going to happen in television. Television is again being disrupted by streamers, and so news channels are either going to have to find some of these alternative revenue streams as well. So it's not going to happen overnight, but over the next 5-10 years, I think all over the world, these business models are going to be severely challenged by the rate of change.
Yes, and I think I'm really happy you mentioned streaming because I saw something interesting yesterday. I was just from my phone flipping through TikTok looking, and I just saw Samsung doing a live streaming of its event live on TikTok, and I began to ask, wonder how much of the revenue that media companies that would have broadcast that how to broadcast events like that live will be losing to platforms like TikTok and other streaming channels. But we'll come back to revenue. I want to bring this trend to how you think it would affect the kinds of stories that get reported in the quest to adjust to the trends. What can you say about the potential impact on underreported stories? So what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that the challenge is partly how do you fund serious hard news, and I think that's getting tougher because partly because advertisers don't want to put ads next to serious news stories or wars or famine or some of these climate change stories, for example. And so, on the advertising side, you've got this sort of incentive almost to produce softer news or news that is so that to some extent may affect decisions in the newsroom about what you write or where you focus. And then some of the new models around subscription also really are pushing people towards creating more high quality content for people who are prepared to pay, whether that's in the field of finance or technology. So in a sense, we're oversupplied with that kind of content because those business models are happening. Whereas sort of, generally politics, not a lot of money in politics. And so, politics is not going away, and it does, of course, continue to attract significant interest. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. If we see more focus on just super serving rich people who've got money to pay for it, what happens to everyone else? And this is traditionally where public service media has stepped in, or popular news brands who just able to sort of really talk to people in a very accessible way. But I think that's a business model that's very, very challenged in this new environment. So yeah, the answer is it's complicated, and there are trends pushing in kind of both directions. But I think the challenge is, how do you fund the kind of journalism people need to make democratic decisions? I think that remains a big gap in many countries.
Yes, thank you. Then another issue I want to bring up has to do with influencers versus journalists. I think probably a month or two ago, I saw a conversation on X, no, not Twitter now, X, regarding the comparing a major YouTuber's number of views on a singular video compared with the number of people that watch big sports events on TV, like the Super Bowl, for instance. Sometimes you will say such live events are watched by, let's say, 30 million or 40 million people, but we have YouTube videos that are getting over 200 million views. So, which means this singular YouTuber could comparatively be saying the argument is these influencers could actually compete and probably gain more attention than conventional media houses. So in this, and I'm happy you mentioned it when you were talking about Dylan on TikTok, whose video is also getting millions of views. Journalists like me, even though I have social media accounts, I don't think I'm still very much active posting every day or can comparatively compete with influencers. So how do you see this trend playing out? And do you think this will continue to be, do you think there is a competition for trust? And you also mentioned the former Fox News employee who is also now building a brand around himself. So is this a replacement? Can we say influencers could replace journalists, or how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that happens is just sort of blurring of the roles, right? So anybody, a journalist, an influencer can talk, build up huge numbers of people and build up a following and do journalism, serious journalism, or in a niche. That's great, right? It increases the diversity. The Is there something special about journalists? What makes a journalist a journalist? Is Dylan Page a journalist? But then you also have social media influencers who may talk about a news story that is important to them, whether that's about climate or about gender or racism that they've experienced or whatever it is, and that's happening too. So I think there's kind of two distinct things. One is basically people trying to be quasi journalists but not working for a newsroom, who understand a platform like Dylan Page, for example, and then you've got influencers who are bringing into the relationships they have things that they care about and are asked to talk about things authentically because their users expect them. So I think it's really hard for journalists to navigate this because there are certain formats of news that imply trust and the way in which people expect the news to be presented. So if you suddenly change all that, maybe the trust of your organization or the journalism goes down. So this is very challenging. This is really what a lot of the big publishers are working through now as they go onto TikTok and they try and engage in a different language. Can they maintain that sense of trust and authenticity in this very, very different environment?
Yeah, thank you very much. Another issue that I'd like to also bring up has to do with the um, how the multiple approaches to AI can influence the media landscape. For instance, 2 days ago, I read about um, one of these major tech company, Apple's potentially disrupting this AI sector with on-device AI that doesn't use a third party, which means many of the individuals will be able to actually run some of these AI services right on their devices. So my question is not just about the specific trend, but the potential effects of these multiple approaches to AI disrupting structures, disrupting approaches that media organizations have, and to address and deal with these issues. So, how do you think the flexibility to adopting and adapting to new changes in the sector could impact or impede journalism in this year?
Yeah, it's a big sort of balancing act. And I think what's interesting about this year is I think a lot of those sort of those dilemmas are going to be worked out to some extent, in that a lot of the templates about how the world is going to work in the next 10 years are going to be defined this year. So whether that's around, how licensing and business model stuff works, or whether it's how you label things within the news environment, or how AI is used in elections and what we think about that. Sort of some of that is going to be shaken out this year, I think. But it's a struggle. The way I think about it is that I think there's clearly sort of efficiency gains, and this is obviously just doesn't apply to journalism, but to almost every sector, which are going to be difficult and disruptive, but basically they can produce better journalism, and that's a positive story that we going to need to work through over the next few years. But at the same time, there's these wider ecosystem changes, which I think we often underestimate. And I think that's the area which is really going to be most disruptive. So what's going to happen to platforms, how that's going to affect traffic flows and business models, but also, as you suggest, what formats. So something like true conversational AI, where it comes back instantly. You kind of need a lot of that to be done on device. So some of the technology that you just talked about from Apple, that's not a trivial problem, by the way, but to enable that to happen, But we don't know how far and fast that's going to go. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be 6 months before all that is available. And then that promise that you can just, you've got this AI concierge on your shoulder and you can literally ask it anything, it will come back with something without having to have that sort of 5 seconds of delay. These are the things that make a difference. And we don't know. We don't really know about how far and how fast this AI revolution is going to happen. My suspicion is it'll happen a bit slower than people think, but will be fundamentally very important. So that's not a message to say don't care about it. It's just a message to say that take time to think about it, because the implications are very significant, and your implications for trust, and you need to move fast, but not too fast.
Yes, and I think I also have a question of monetization, and I believe long before we had these shifts of interest to artificial intelligence, we've always had this issue of attention span of readers. What am I trying to say? Sometimes I still enjoy writing long feature stories. I love long feature stories a lot, but some media houses I currently work with, or that I've also worked with in the past, one or two editors came to me and told me that sometimes people are only interested in that first paragraph. Some will get to the second paragraph. Very few would actually get to the end of the story. Which means if you are somebody that is writing 2,000 words, the first paragraph could be the only one that many people would write that would contain the summary of the story. And why am I asking this question? I've been testing the WhatsApp channels for some of these media organizations, media houses. And in some cases, you could have an idea of what is happening, of what we can actually say the news. The news in the convention to the general public is what is happening. And from that summary, you may actually get the news and just move on with your day and not really need to actually read the whole thing, which means that if media houses are fully relying on converting those that are interested in reading the full story, they may not be able to capture everybody that is getting that. So, and that would be a really, really sharp drop in the market size, in the potential revenue generation for the industry. What do you say to this trend? And do we have anything working to actually ensure that media houses are able to gain some revenue from every reader?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, but essentially there are different kind of needs. That's what we found in doing the research. So it's not the case that nobody's ever interested in long form. Just think about podcasts, and some people listen to podcasts for hours. But in the course of our day, quite often what we need is, we don't need to be bombarded with loads and loads of news. We just need to pick up the headlines to converse about what's happened today. And then there might be other times of the week when we've got time to really sort of sit back and really try and get into an issue in depth. So I think it's not a completely bleak picture where nobody's ever going to be interested in long form. But I think what is going to be needed is to provide content in lots of different formats more easily, so people can choose whether they want and accessible formats. This is what I was showing with the summarization at the top of stories. Some people will just want the summary, and that's fine. But if you can entice them to read on and to build up a deeper sense of what that story is about, if they're interested in that, then can we do that better? I'm sure we can do that better than we've done up until now. Can we use better formats? If you can tell a story in 60 seconds really effectively, why do we make people watch 3 minutes or 10 minutes? So I think it's trying to right size the formats or provide more alternative formats. And I think that's part of what we need to do, but also just to, some of these things are societal. People need to be interested in news. They need to feel that politics is relevant to them. So it's not just about the news industry. It's also about, some of these fundamental problems of why politics doesn't feel relevant to people. Can't hear you.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. And I think probably the last question that we have right here has to do with your perception regarding the media industry's heavy reliance on the tech sector. It seems as if media houses are playing catch up. It seems as if media houses are struggling to are adjusting to whatever the tech sector throws at them, and continues to heavily rely on the tech industry for revenue generation and for distribution. Now we are looking at this AI, and for instance, the search approach to using AI potentially threatening the revenues of media industry itself. So how is there hope for the media industry to not have to continually adjust to whatever the tech sector throws at the sector? Few hours before starting this webinar, I saw a conversation between Channel 4 in the UK and High TV. They are throwing banters at each other on Threads, and I think one of those media houses was on Threads before and decided to stop posting. We are seeing media houses moving from one platform to another because of one issue to another. So how do you see these tech and media sector dynamics evolving? Is it possible for the media industry to affirmatively decide its own future, irrespective of what the tech sector is doing?
It's difficult, obviously, because platforms have so much power in terms of, this is where audiences are voting with their feet and they're going there and starting their journeys there. So you have to be, to some extent, where people are. But it's also why we saw in the data, you saw publishers trying to build up these direct relationships. And so I think really focusing on audience needs and maybe not satisfying everyone, but satisfying a particular group of people, so you do have those direct connections, is part of taking back that control. I think the other thing that we're seeing is, publishers really need to learn the lessons of what happened in the social media era, and then as we move into this AI era, not make the same mistakes. So that is about being more deliberate about not just sort of splurging it out everywhere onto every platform, but saying which audiences are we after, which audiences do we think we can get directly, and where can we go to find the audiences that we're missing. And the answer will be different for different publishers, but it's not a sort of one size fits all. It's a much more deliberative approach, much more intentional way of using these platforms, rather than just letting the platforms thing happen to them. Have your own view of what you're trying to do, and then use platforms appropriately. And I think that's the general idea. Actually implementing that, of course, is very hard.
One quick one before I ask for last remarks. Any thoughts regarding the radio journalism? Anything happening uniquely to radio this year?
Well, I think, I mean, I'm a massive fan of radio, and I started my career in radio. And I think in many ways we've seen it less disrupted than many other, television or other formats, because it's something that you can do while you're doing something else. And it also, I think, fits really well into the digital age, because people have headphones in. I think some of these devices are going to become more important. Audio is going to become more important. But again, I think, it's changing. You have to take the same ideas and work out what does that mean in a world where you can listen live, you can listen on demand. How much effort do you put into live radio compared with podcasts? What we're seeing is, I talked about visualized podcasts, but the other trend we're seeing is podcasts that start as podcasts and then go back onto the radio. So instead of commissioning more radio, you commission more podcasts and then put those podcasts back into a flow radio stream as built programs. So that's another trend that I think we're going to see a lot more of. Yeah, and people love audio. It's one of the things that really works for young people as well. So, younger people are much more likely, because they're out and about a lot and they've got headphones and smartphones, to use audio. So it's a great way of reaching that next generation.
Yes, I really do agree with you on the radio sector's being reluctant, being the least disrupted by tech. And I think it's probably okay for that sector. But I think the innovations, disruptions are also happening gradually, like you said, with podcasts and providing media houses with opportunities to actually expand their reach and adjust to the platforms that tech has already provided. What are you personally looking forward to as we round off regarding this ecosystem in the new year?
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing how publishers navigate these very difficult challenges, and I'm really looking forward to um, how all this plays out in elections. You know, I think these are, from a media observer point of view, elections are always such an interesting thing because the publishers do a lot of innovation, but also lots of things happen that you don't expect to happen. So so yeah, we don't know what those things are. We can't predict them, but they're going to happen. The unpredictable is going to happen this year.
The unpredictable is going to happen this year. I like that, and somehow scared about that. So before we close the show, what is happening? What is the institute? What can you say about what is happening at the institute this year? How many other reports should we be expecting this year? And what are you looking? What should our audience know about what is happening at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism?
So we're doing a lot of work in the digital news report on artificial intelligence and audience perception. So I think that's the missing piece right now, is how audiences responding to what they see in social media, what they see publishers doing. So we're doing some qualitative and quantitative work around that, which we'll publish in June. Also looking at things like user needs in much more detail to try and understand better trust. So there's a range of things that will be coming out in June that hopefully will be interesting. And then the usual range of sort of seminars and interesting topics from our journalist fellows who produce reports from all over the world on the challenges that journalists face.
Yeah, thank you so much. So those are really exciting periods for journalists and of course for the entire people at the Reuters Institute. So I want to thank Nick very, very much for accepting our invitation. Thank you for sharing insight. And we are going to pass all of these insights across to all our forum members and of course those that engage with us in the sector. And if you desire to watch this video, it will soon be available on YouTube. We are going to share it extensively. We are also going to write extensively on this issue so that you can document and come back to it also. And Nick has already agreed to share the slides with us. So we will be passing these slides to all registered attendees of this webinar, in addition to sharing it on our Facebook forum. So if you are not part of that Facebook forum, I just put the link in the chat box below. And one more time, the report that we've been discussing about is available on Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism's website. I just put the link again in the box, and I hope you are going to check it out and consult it and digest it and understand how the ecosystem is going to actually play out. It's going to be a very, very busy year. It has already been looking like a very busy year. We had issues that we brought over from 2023, even some issues before 2023 that are still major issues in the new year. And as journalists, we hope you are going to be reporting on the stories appropriately. So thank you very much, Nick, for accepting our invitation. Before I close the show, I want to intimate our attendees on probably something we are trying to do is which opportunities you should be aware of that could be of benefit and relevant to the subject that we are doing and focusing on in the forum. And I will take you to the HygiNet platform, which has some opportunities that are actually that would soon close. For instance, the deadline is fast approaching for the Society of Environmental Journalists grant. So journalists can get a grant of up to $5,000 to support their environmental reporting. There is also there are also training opportunities, data visualization for individuals in Latin America. We also have fellowships in public service journalism for journalists in the US. And there are a lot of training opportunities currently that you can actually see and consult. But it's important that if you check out those that are relevant. I remember seeing this one too that closes actually today, which is actually global in nature. It's the Health Journalism Networks grant for indigenous environmental stories. And we also have investigation grants for environmental journalism in Europe. That one is also closing today. And the one that I mentioned, which is the one for the Society of Environmental Journalists, is closing tomorrow. All of these opportunities are available. More information about them are available on ignet.org. You go to the opportunities page on IGNet's website. So I want to thank you very much for attending this webinar. Thank you very much for Nick. And we look forward to seeing how this year is going to play out. And hopefully the promising and most positive aspects of this report are going to materialize. And the ones that will not be nice to the industry, but hopefully the sector will be able to circumvent them with brilliant innovations, and things are going to work positively for our industry this year. So thank you very much, Nick. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.